just keeps going. Okay. Wow. Holy cow. So, I've mentioned in the past that I'm a music teacher, and specifically a choral one. So, with that, obviously, I had to learn a lot about the different voice types that there are in singing, and especially when it came down to the differences between opera voice types and choral voice types. And it can be a very confusing topic when you really start getting into it, because there's a lot of names for very similar things, or things that you think are the same but just maybe have a slight bit of difference to them. So today I figured I'd talk about the various voice types and how we define them in opera versus how do we define them in choir. Now, I also want to go over some definition rules here. The defining of these various voice types can get very confusing very quickly. So I'm going to use some specific terms to be crystal clear about exactly what I'm talking about. One thing that I'm going to mention is traditionally female and traditionally male voice types. I'll use the terms traditionally male and traditionally female because that's what they are. They're traditionally associated with either being a male voice type or a female voice type. However, on the other hand, I've known plenty of people who have broken these rules. People who are female and have sung male voice parts, or people who are male and have sung female voice parts. It's especially common in choir. And since we're talking about some choral voice types as well as operatic ones, it's better to be specific in identifying what they traditionally are while still giving some examples of people who have broken those rules. So, for example, tenor. Tenor is traditionally a male voice part role. However, I've known plenty of females who have sung tenor parts because of what they are able to do. So for simplicity's sake, since these lines can get blurred very quickly, I'm just going to identify a role as either being traditionally male or traditionally female and giving some exceptions beyond that. But with that, let's start to dive into the 7 main categories of voice parts and their various subtypes. So, starting at the very top, we've got sopranos. So, soprano is traditionally a female role. There aren't too many examples of men singing soprano roles, but there are some examples of young boys singing soprano roles, as their voices haven't changed yet and they're still able to hit those really high notes. So, a soprano voice range starts at about a C4, which is middle C, up to a C6, which is then 2 octaves above that middle C. In a choral setting, sopranos will take the higher parts singing the really high notes on top, and will be broken down into soprano 1, soprano 2, soprano 3, soprano 4, etc., however many soprano parts the composer feels like writing for. With the lower the value of the number, like 1, the higher parts you will end up singing. With the first parts singing the highest notes, second parts singing beneath that, and any other number that you may have singing in slightly lower ranges than the other voice parts. Now, in modern choral music, soprano 1s tend to sing the very top notes, and soprano 2s tend to sing a little bit beneath that. However, in more historical choral music, soprano 1s and 2s were pretty similar and would often flip-flop back and forth between the two. So just because it says soprano 1 doesn't mean it's only going to sing the highest of the notes. Sometimes they do tend to cross voice parts, as is the case for many of the other voice types. Now, in operatic terms, we've got 5 main voice types. So the difference between operatic voice types and choral voice types is choral voice types tend to break down into who sings the highest note and who sings the lowest note, while operatic voice types tend to break down into what are you able to do with your voice? What does your voice sound like? What kind of characteristics does it bring to mind? What kind of agility can you do? So operatic voice types have more to do with your technical abilities and the tone quality of your voice, compared to choral voice types, which have more to do with where is your range. So the first of the operatic soprano voice types is the coloratura. This is a voice subtype we will see in many of the other categories, but this one specifically is usually heavily associated with the soprano. This is also my voice type. You may be able to pick up on some of the characteristics of coloratura sopranos through what you can hear through my speaking voice. Coloraturas are very high in pitch. They tend to be one of the highest singers up there. They have very bright voices, as mine definitely is. and they are very, very agile. That is like the key defining feature of any coloratura type. So these are the singers that are singing those crazy runs and those crazy passages that I had to sing way too many times in college. Right underneath that, we have soubrette. Soubrette sopranos refer to more of a specific character rather than a voice sound or voice quality or voice ability. These are more of the very coy and kind of cheeky soprano roles. They are very similar to the coloraturas in terms of where they're range-wise. They're very high, they're much more bright, but they lack that coloratura agility that the coloratura sopranos have. Right next to that, we have the lyric sopranos. So lyric is another voice type that is across many of the other categories, with the lyric category referring to their ability to sing very lyrical pieces. So lyric sopranos aren't quite as bright in their voice types. They have a much richer and fuller sound, but they're not too dark. They're a nice balance in between a really bright sound and a really dark sound. Lyric types also don't reach quite as high as a more coloratura or soubrette sound, but they're not going to be able to sing much lower and deeper and darker notes. They sit nice in the middle. Next up, we have spinto. Spinto is kind of an in-between voice type. Again, you'll see this come up throughout several of the other ones we'll talk about. Spinto sits right in between a lyric, so that nice balanced voice type, and dramatic, which we'll get to in just a sec, which is more of a darker voice type. So spinto kind of fills the role of that no man's land of really dark and kind of just well blended. And finally, we have dramatic sopranos. Dramatic sopranos are very well known, even outside the realm of opera, for the role of Brunhilde. Brunhilde is a dramatic soprano. That very dark sound, which to some people's ears can almost sound as if it's being covered. Dramatic sopranos are kind of the opposite of coloraturas. Very dark, very heavy, and they don't move around a lot. They'll kind of sit and hold on to notes versus the coloraturas, which are just kind of rapidly spinning around them. Dramatic sopranos are also very, very good at being able to sing over a blaring orchestra or blaring orchestra. Yeah. Dramatic sopranos are also very, very good at being able to sing over a blaring orchestra. That dark, dramatic sound lends well to them having just a powerhouse of a voice. Moving on to the next category of voices, we have mezzo-sopranos. Mezzo-sopranos sit about from an A3 or an A below middle C, all the way up to an A5, so 2 octaves above that. Mezzo-sopranos are a traditionally female voice type, and in my experience, they tend to be probably one of the most common female voice types that are out there. Which kind of makes sense if you think about it. You know, if people's voices are on a bell curve, and you're talking female voice types, that kind of middle of the road sound is probably going to be one of the most common ones you'll run into. So in a choral sense, mezzo-sopranos aren't a true voice type, as there's not really a position for mezzo-sopranos to sing. Typically, mezzo-sopranos will sing a soprano 2 voice part, or they'll sing altos depending on where they kind of prefer or where their voice range kind of leans towards. Mezzo-sopranos tend to break down into about 3 categories or so. Again, we have coloraturas, which are similar to soprano roles. However, because they're mezzo-sopranos, they're not going to sing nearly as high as the soprano coloraturas. Mezzo-soprano coloraturas are still going to have the crazy agility that coloraturas are supposed to have, just not quite as high on the range as sopranos would be. However, they can sing significantly lower than soprano coloraturas. Again, right in the middle, we have lyric mezzo-sopranos. Now, these are probably one of the more common mezzo-soprano voice types, and a lot of these mezzo-soprano lyric roles, especially in older opera, tend to be pants roles or trouser roles, meaning that a woman is playing the part of a young man or a young boy, kind of trying to signify maybe he hasn't completely gone through puberty, and so his voice is still kind of high. Then, of course, on the lower end of mezzo-sopranos, we have the dramatic mezzo-sopranos. Again, that dark voice type, not middle of the road like lyrics, not super bright like coloraturas, very dark and very heavy. And a lot of these roles tend to be more of the evil stepmother. Makes sense, as we tend to, in operatic terms, associate a darker female sound with being an older woman or more of an evil woman. So these dramatic mezzo-sopranos tend to get the evil witch or the evil stepmother roles. So last on our list of traditionally female roles, we have the alto, or the contralto, as is the full name. An alto range tends to be about an F3, so an F below middle C, all the way up to an F5, or about 2 octaves above that. Now, while alto is a traditionally female voice part, it's not too uncommon for men to have to, on occasion, sing an alto part, especially in a choral setting. Tenors and altos tend to have a lot of overlapping range, so the higher tenors will sometimes be bumped up to sing an alto role if the numbers and the balance of the choir requires it. In my experience, I find more altos in the choral setting than the operatic setting, because a lot of choral altos are more just mezzo-sopranos in disguise, whereas when you're talking in an operatic setting, altos do need to have that strong, rich, full lower range in order to properly sing the parts that they've been given. You can break down the contralto voice type into coloratura, lyric, and dramatic, but the coloratura and dramatic ones tend to be very, very, very rare, especially in terms of parts that are written for them. So typically, when referring to this in the operatic sense, we tend to just kind of refer to this as the alto or contralto voice part. Moving on down the piano, we have just a little bit underneath that is the countertenor. Now this is a traditionally male voice part, but it's a pretty uncommon one at that. Countertenors tend to range from about an E3 to an E5, so an E below middle C up to 2 octaves above that. And if you paid attention, that's really only one note below where the alto lies. So in other words, altos and countertenors essentially have the same exact voice range, which means that countertenors can easily sing alto parts if need be, and altos can easily sing countertenor parts if need be. However, countertenor, again, tends to be a little bit more of an operatic voice type, so you'll probably just see countertenors in a choral setting being made to sing alto parts, unless there's a really crazy high tenor part that no other tenor can hit. Countertenors don't really break down too much into any kind of subcategory. You can probably find them out there, but again, it's similar to the contralto situation where there's not enough voice parts out there that are written in operatic terms to really quantify truly categorizing it in the way we do, say, like soprano or tenor. Speaking of tenor, that's all I got. The tenor range goes from about a C3, so exactly an octave below middle C, to a C5, or exactly an octave above middle C. Tenors are probably one of the most complicated to categorize. Again, in a choral setting, similar to sopranos, we have tenor 1, tenor 2, tenor 3, etc., 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 with tenor 1s being the highest voice part, tenor 2s being beneath that, so on, so forth. Choral's pretty easy to identify. On an operatic term, however, there are so many different subcategories that you can just go on and on and on. So I'm going to cover a few of the basics here. I'm not going to cover all of them because if I said I was going to try to cover all of them, I would probably get someone in the comments saying, well, you forgot about this voice type. Because it's just, you can kind of make up your own definition and you get a new tenor subcategory. At the very top, we have the leggero tenor, which is essentially just a tenor coloratura. Coloratura tends to be reserved for more female voice types, but it can work. You can call it coloratura tenor and you won't be wrong, but it's typically referred to as the leggero tenor. So again, this voice type is very bright, it sings the very high notes, not quite as high as the countertenor, but it's very bright, very high, and has that agility that the coloratura types are known for. Next up, we have the lyric tenor. This is the really beautiful, really sweet, lyrical pieces. Not too bright, not too dark, sits right in the middle and gets all the beautiful, lovely solos that tenors are known for. Then, going a little bit darker, we have the spinto type again. Spinto kind of being that bridge between the lyric and the more dramatic and darker voice types. It's a little bit more towards the darker side, but not really heavy. These types can have a little bit more of a heft to them, especially when you're comparing the upper range of what they can sing and you compare it against the lyric and the leggero tenors, because those voice types are going to be very bright compared to the spinto, but it's not that kind of powerhouse that the dramatic type is going to be. So then of course you have the dramatic tenors. Dramatic tenors, very dark, very heavy, have that ability to just powerhouse and sing over the orchestra and just sing to the walls. And there are some great examples of dramatic tenors and dramatic tenor roles. So moving even further down the piano, we have the baritones. These are, again, a traditionally male voice part with not too many exceptions to that rule. This is because you're going to need a lot of testosterone in your body to get your vocal folds to thicken up enough to be able to reach these lower notes. Baritone is also probably one of the most common male voice types that I've encountered. So if mezzo-soprano is one of the more common female voice types, again, in my experience, then it makes sense for baritone to be the most common male voice type that I've encountered. So baritones sing from about an A2 or an A 2 octaves below middle C to about an A4 or the A just above middle C. In a choral setting, baritones are typically just baritones. I don't often see this voice type broken up into baritone 1, baritone 2, unless you've got a lot of male voice parts that you want to cover, because typically you'll have tenor 1s, tenor 2s, and baritone and bass, rather than bass 1 or bass 2, or baritone 1 or baritone 2. And then on the operatic hand, there's not a lot of subcategories for baritone. It's just more of the same stuff we've already covered, with lyric baritones, again, being more of that not too bright, not too dark kind of sound, and dramatic baritones being that very deep, heavy, dark, dramatic sound. If you want to go searching, there are a few more. For example, Verdi baritones, which refer to baritone roles written in Verdi operas. But once you start getting to that level of kind of subcategorization, then you have a whole lot of other composers that you can refer to, and all the other voice types that I've already mentioned, and too much for this one little video. Now, the thing to note about baritone voice types in opera, and this also goes for bass, as we'll get to in a second, is a lot of baritone roles tend to fit into one of two categories. Either they're kind of the comedy relief, they're kind of the haha funny man, or they're the evil villain. So lyric baritones tend to fit more of that comedy genre because they've got a little bit lighter voice, they've got a little bit brighter voice. And dramatic baritones tend to fit more of that evil, maniacal villain role a lot better. But the lowest of the bunch, on the very, very bottom, we have the bass type. These are the people who can sing extremely low. This is a traditionally male voice type, again, with almost no exceptions, because like the baritone ones, you gotta have a lot of testosterone in your system for your vocal folds to be thick enough to sing this low. Basses sing from about an E2, so only the second E on the piano, up to about an E4, or that E just a little bit above middle C. Basses in a choral setting can break down again into bass 1, bass 2, bass 3 if you really need to, but typically it's just basses, again splitting with baritones on the very bottom few notes of the choir. In an operatic sense, basses can be split into roughly 3 categories. Again, maybe a few more, but we're just going to talk about 3 right now. The first of which is bass baritone, which is kind of that in-between bridge of not fully baritone, but not fully bass either. They're kind of sitting nicely in the middle. They typically sing more in that baritone range, but are able to sing more of the lower bass notes. The second bass type is the buffo, with buffo being the Italian word for comedy. Again, these are these comedic voice roles. I'm not really sure how basses and baritones and all these lower male voice types got placed into being the comedy relief, but I guess if there's not really any heroic roles being written for them, they gotta find that comedic relief somewhere, right? And then lastly, we have basso profundo. These are the lowest of the low. These people have very dark, very rich, very heavy sounds and can sing basically to the end of the piano and beyond. These are the ones that we typically think of when we think of bass voice singers, even though they're really not that common at all. In fact, in my experience, it's kind of hard to find more true bass voice types because a lot of low singers tend to be more of that baritone range with the ability to sing lower bass notes rather than actually being genuine true bass singers or even further beyond that. So I hope you learned something today. I hope you learned about the different voice types and where they are and what kind of roles they have to play in the operatic world. So if you like this video and you'd like to see more of it, subscribe to the channel and I'll see you next time. Bye. Now in modern choral music, the way that I'm... They do need to be... We have the baritone. Oh, jeez. Baritones don't tip. Why? We have motorcycles and cars outside.